Welcome to Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College. And today we're fortunate to have Alexander Murphy, professor emeritus at the University of Oregon and past president of the Association of American Geographers. Alec, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Nice to see you, and I look forward to the conversation.
That's great. You know, like I start many of these conversations, I think the audience, the viewers, and the listeners would really like to know what really inspired you to pursue geography. They'd like to know a little bit more about you than what is commonly known, and your upbringing and your schooling, undergraduate years, and certainly your graduate years, and those individuals that maybe inspired you. And I might even interject a few comments along the way. So please tell us your story.
Great. And please do interject comments. That would be great. Well, one path that explains why I ended up as a geographer is perhaps a bit unusual for many, but is not unusual for everyone. People like Andrew Marcus and Michael Kanzen all had the same experience I did, which was to grow up in a household with a father who was a geographer. So I knew about geography from early on. My dad never actually particularly encouraged me to follow in his footsteps, but he was just always such an interesting person to wander around the world with and talk to, and his broad-ranging interests, I think, were infectious in a certain way. I was born actually in Washington, D.C., but we moved out to Laramie, Wyoming before I could really remember much. He had fallen in love with the American West while doing research for his doctoral dissertation at Clark on private inholdings in wilderness areas in the American West. And so my main growing up years were first in Laramie, Wyoming, primary school, and then Albuquerque, New Mexico. He joined the department of the University of New Mexico when it was just he and Yifu Tuan as the only two professors there. And sort of built the department from there. So my junior high school years were in New Mexico. But we had sabbaticals and grants that took me during those growing up years to Paris for a year, Paris, France, not Texas, and to Sendai, Japan, and to Honolulu, Hawaii. So those kind of helped to broaden horizons too. I ended up at Yale as an undergrad. Yale, sadly, like some other institutions in the United States of reasonable reputation, had more or less walked away from geography by the late 1960s. There was still someone teaching a geography course that I took as an undergrad, but that was sort of a holdover. How unusual that is in the larger landscape of geography and higher education around the world really came home to me the year after I graduated from Yale, when I was over in Germany on a grant for a year, and I talked to a German professor, and he said, "So tell me about the geography department at Yale." And I kind of looked down and said, "Well, I'm afraid there isn't one." And I'll never forget, he gave me this kind of quizzical look, and he said, "But I thought Yale was a university." So that was kind of an interesting reflection. Of course, something that I knew a bit about anyway. But I had majored actually in archaeology as an undergrad. So archaeology, anthropology, fairly broad-ranging, kind of degree. Really didn't quite know what I wanted to do, as many undergraduates who finished their undergraduate studies are like. But I was at Yale as an undergrad, had been exposed to a lot of different things, and managed to land this grant in Germany for the year. And of course, then you start figuring, what's the next step? And it was not long after I got there that I realized, gosh, applications are already due for the next fall. And I was sort of thinking, well, I've done these things international. I wasn't sure yet that I wanted to do an academic career. I thought, well, international law, this would open up potentially lots of windows and could be quite interesting. So I only applied, I guess it's a reflection of how serious I was, only to 2 or 3 programs that had strong international law orientation, and ended up at Columbia University in New York City. And first year curriculum's pretty much prescribed, but second and third year, I took a lot of international and comparative law classes. A couple of them are actually in some ways a bit responsible for where I ended up. So one of them, a course on comparative law taught by a man by the name of John Hazard. We had a lot of, it was really a seminar, and we had a lot of chance to just work on a big term paper on anything that was of interest to us. And I guess, because I had some background and interest in geography, I thought, well, there are beginning to be some interesting links between geography and law. And I discovered that there was a 3-volume work that had been written early in the 20th century by a famous evidence scholar who got interested in geography. And it was called A Geography of the World's Legal Systems. He ended up actually publishing in the Geographical Review, and he was interested in why different approaches to law develop in particular cultural and social contexts, political contexts, and then the diffusion of those ideas, mapping the diffusion of legal systems like we do with languages or religions or something like that. So I wrote a big paper about this, and my professor called me in after he had a chance to read it. And I guess I managed to impress him, because he said, this is really kind of remarkable piece of scholarship you've done here. Have you ever thought about an academic career? Well, of course, I had, because I'd grown up in an academic household, but I wasn't necessarily yet, quite in that direction. But he said, you've shown what would strike me as, proclivity for that kind of career, and you might consider it. And there are 2 ways of going. One would be to go the law route, but some of these more specialized comparative law classes we teach at Columbia, they're not taught very many places. So you probably need a more bread and butter specialty. But he said, the other thing you could do would be get a PhD in a field with some relationship to this. And you've shown all this interest in geography. By the way, one of my good friends is a geography professor at the University of Chicago by the name of Chauncey Harris.
What a great gentleman Chauncey Harris happened to be.
Indeed, absolutely. And what he didn't know, he had no idea that my father was a geographer. What he also didn't know was that when I was 14 years old and my dad had a Fulbright and we were living in Sendai, Japan, Chauncey visited Japan, some kind of an official visit. He came up to Sendai for a day, and my father was asked to sort of show him around, and I tagged along with them during that day. So I actually met Chauncey Harris at that point. So, that, I think that conversation certainly was influential in a way. But, I've spent the time getting a law degree. I wanted to give the practice of law a try. And I certainly don't think of that law school time as wasted time. Well, I met my wife. That would be one thing. But,
that's a major coup right there.
That's right. And she's actually went on to be a law professor with me at the same institution here at the University of Oregon. It was also, I think there's a kind of discipline to the way you think about things and write that comes with legal training. And I was also got introduced to a variety of issues that are of relevance to political geography in the international arena, various kinds of ways in which territorial disputes are dealt with, the whole arena in which international law represents certain kind of normative understandings about how the world should be organized and so forth that stayed with me. But I did think I should at least try practicing law. So, but my wife and I, we got married right at the end of law school. We're kind of figuring, well, we wouldn't necessarily spend the rest of our life in a really big city, but it's always easier to go from bigger to smaller. Let's look at places like Washington, D.C. and Boston and Chicago. But we chose Chicago partly because I was thinking, I'll give this a try, but maybe I might want to find my way back to academia. And I knew that there was a strong geography department at the time there. I had a little bit of an entree with Chauncey Harris and so forth. So we ended up moving to Chicago and taking jobs at 2 law firms in Chicago. What that meant for me is there wasn't a lot of international law I was doing. It was kind of a general litigation, corporate litigation practice that I was in. And I kind of enjoyed doing the research for the cases. And, when you're a junior associate, you're not necessarily, the lead person, although I got to do a small trial on my own and things of that sort. And it was interesting in a way. But when I look forward to the people who are 10 or 15 years ahead of me and ask myself, is that really where I want to be? And maybe if I'd chosen something other than litigation, I would have thought about it in a different way. But, litigation's kind of a contentious thing, and I would find myself lying in bed at night with the
And it
stomach.
can be very stressful.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I'm a bit more of a kind of consensus guy than a conflict guy. And so I thought, I'm not sure this is where I want my future to be. So I got in touch with Chauncey Harris just to sort of see what might be possible. And he put together a lunch at the Chicago Faculty Club with Marvin Mikesell, Norton Ginsburg, and himself, 3 former AAG presidents. And I went down and had lunch with them one day and talked to them about the program. And it sounded interesting enough that I, of course, had to go through the entire regular application process and so forth. They weren't, wasn't an issue of, sort of getting in any abnormal way. But I went ahead and applied, and it worked out. They accepted me, gave me a scholarship to cover the tuition and so forth. And then I had to really make the decision. And I thought, I really think I should try this. So with being supported by my wife, who was willing to allow me to commit fiscal suicide and go to grad school, I went on down to the University of Chicago. And I will say, there's all sorts of good lawyer jokes going around, but my law firm did a very nice thing which made it easier. When I announced that I was going back to grad school in geography, I think some of them thought, well, has he kind of lost his bearings? But the executive committee met a few days later. They called me back in. They said, okay, look, if you decide after a year that you've made a mistake, we'll hire you back into your old position, which was really great because it meant I could start graduate school without feeling like I was just throwing everything overboard. To be sure, it wasn't hard for them to do. I mean, this was a growing firm at a time when the law business was growing, so they weren't making any great sacrifice to do this. But it helped to start me off that way. So then it's off to University of Chicago. I took my first classes were with Marvin Mikesell, with Jim Westcoat, who was on the faculty there, with Norton Ginsburg.
I think, let me interject something now. I believe it might have been Ron Wixman, like 30 years ago, perhaps, that told me that Marvin Mikesell would hold undergraduate classes at something like 8 in.the.morning. And these classes were always full. The classes were filled with students. They were just captivated by him. Is that an experience that you can?
I think he had graduated to having classes a little bit later than 8 in.the.morning, which is good for me because. Yeah. But he was an interesting guy because when you saw Marvin and you talked to him, he would come across as a kind of shy, a little bit awkward around people kind of guy, and you put him in front of a classroom and he was captivating, and that explains why he would attract. So many undergrads. And it was partly, I think, the first class I took with him, which was a cultural geography class. It took me about 3 weeks before I knew that I was doing what was right for me. In other words, I never really looked back. Of course, grad school has its challenges. You have to do this and that. I was actually lucky enough to, Chauncey Harris retired after my first year. I took his last class that he ever taught, which was great. But I ended up then sort of gravitating maybe a little bit because of foreign experiences, exposure to language, exposure to political territorial things. I began thinking maybe I should do something about the relationship between how territory gets organized and underlying cultural patterns, particularly linguistic patterns. And I'd had a fair amount of background in Europe by that point. I had spent a year growing up in a French public school. I had lived in Germany afterwards, and I began looking around at places where I might do this. And Belgium came to mind. Here's this country divided between a Flemish or Dutch-speaking North and a French-speaking South. And I didn't know all that much about it, but I had actually written a little paper about it at one point, and I thought, this could be an interesting place to do my doctoral dissertation.
Well, and as you remarked in your dissertation, there is relative parity between the French speakers and the Flemish speakers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, numerically, the Flemish speakers have been larger in number, but the French speakers are not so small as just to be viewed as a small minority. And historically, I mean, in the 19th century, where the French speakers were, this was the economically dynamic part of the country. This was one of the first parts of continental Europe to industrialize and so forth. And so, I put together an application, got a Fulbright grant, went over then to Belgium. My wife was able to take a leave of absence from her law firm, and she got hired by a Belgian law firm for the year, and dived into a study I hadn't quite figured out fully what I wanted to do with, as I think many doctoral students are. But I still remember a signal moment when I started to realize what I wanted to do for my doctoral dissertation, and why thinking geographically about the issues of language and regionalism and so forth in Belgium was really key. And if I could take a moment, this is the moment. So periodically, I was doing research at the National Library and the National Archives there, and I picked up a copy of the Financial Times, which is, of course, a serious newspaper published in London. They often have, it's not just a business newspaper. They, of course, have, good coverage of things going on and around the world. And Belgium, like many times, had been going through some significant difficulties between the Flemish and the Walloon community about how to deal with certain issues, and a bit of a governmental crisis around all this. And so there was an article about this in the Financial Times. And the article began with something along the lines of the following quote: "Asked recently why Flemish-speaking Flanders and French-speaking Wallonia should have united in 1830 to form a common state, a Belgian commentator noted unequivocally, it was an historical accident." And my jaw dropped when I saw that statement, because that statement makes about as much sense as the entire statement is if you had come on, we're talking in June, where it's quite warm where you are, and you had come on, and it's a little cooler where I am, but we're not in the winter. If you had come into the interview today and you had said, "Alec, why did you decide to talk to me today in the midst of the snowstorms that we're having?" In other words, you're making an assumption that is completely nonsensical. And I just said, "Oh, I felt like it." Asked recently why Flemish-speaking Flanders and French-speaking Wallonia should have united in 1830 to form a common state. Sure, Belgium achieved its independence in 1830. The term Wallonia wasn't coined until 50 years later. Flanders at the time meant the old medieval Flanders, which was northwestern Belgium, but adjacent parts of the Netherlands and France. So what this question assumes is that the political organization of territory is just a place name. We see it on a map now. Yeah, there's a modern administrative language region called Flanders and one called Wallonia, and it's just a place name. And then you just use that to frame your thinking about the problem.
And these are common misconceptions with place names worldwide.
So absolutely right. So I realized there had been an interesting article written about the whole development of the Flemish movement that was seeking greater rights within the states, and then the Walloon reaction and so forth. It was called The Making of Flemings and Walloons, so the coming to being of this kind of consciousness. And I thought, there's a parallel story that's being almost largely missed in all the discussions about this. It's the making of Flanders and Wallonia as territorial political constructs. And you can't understand the making of Flemings and Walloons if you don't understand how those territorial arrangements came into being and how they started to shape and reflect everything from where people lived and their activity patterns, even to their senses of ethno-linguistic identity. So that was basically what I turned into my doctoral dissertation that I was later able to publish as a book in the Chicago Geography series. So anyway, I got that together during the course of my year in Belgium. I came back to Chicago. I had some space to work at the university because Carl Blitzer at that point had decamped to the University of Texas. and I had a nice space to work, and I ended up writing up my dissertation. So I did actually my entire PhD in 4 years, which is on somewhat fast, but it was kind of a second career for me, so I was really wanted to get on the go.
Well, and you had the inclination to write judiciously from your law school training and your practice.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
yeah.
And I would like to insert a comment here too, is that, you dedicated it to your father who showed you the world, which is both touching, but also very important with reference to how perhaps he was an inspiration in the background.
That's right. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, that's the way to put it. Yeah, he never said, "Oh, you should do what I do," anything like that. But he was clearly an inspiration. And sadly, my dad died much too young of not very common disease, and he had been from a family of long-lived people, so it was really kind of a surprise. So I think that was also a reflection of how I was thinking about my dad. But he unquestionably was an inspiration. That's absolutely right. And then on the writing side, I think I went into writing the dissertation both a bit with that kind of legal writing training behind me, but also I wanted to write it as close to what would work for a dissertation, but what would be a book as well, because I thought this is really a book. And so that was a great advantage, actually, because then I was able to turn it into a book within fairly short order after I got my PhD. But during that write-up year, the job market in geography was not good. This was 1987, and there were really few jobs that were being advertised in geography at the time. But it was not long after I got back that there was an ad for a job at the University of Oregon that was broad enough to where I could see I could kind of fit within the remit of the ad. But it was early because I was just back. I was just starting to write up. And I went to Marvin Mikesell, who was my primary advisor. My other committee members at that point were Norton Ginsburg and Michael Konzen and Chauncey Harris. So Chauncey, even though he had retired, could sort of continue on. So a bit of an all-star, geography committee. But I went to Marvin, Mr. Mikesell to me at the time,
Emulating the years with Sauer, I guess, huh?
Yeah, that's right. The norm at Chicago was, even for grad students, was not to refer to faculty by their first names. And in fact, the norm also, though, was not to use professor or doctor. It was always Mr. or Ms., which was, kind of the norm at the time. So it was Mr. Harris, Mr. Ginsburg, Mr. Mikesell. So I went to Marvin and I said, what do you think? And he was actually a little bit discouraging of my applying for the job. And he said, I've seen sometimes, he had a recent example of someone who started applying for jobs really before they were, far enough along. And then they get kind of immersed in thinking about the jobs and the places, and they don't make the progress that they want to make on their dissertation. And I went back from that conversation and thought about it for a little bit. And I went back to him and I said, look, if you think about my career as a grad student, I've always met the deadlines and things that you've asked me to do. I'm not going to apply for a blizzard of jobs, but there aren't very many. And this one actually is in a place that I thought I might really like to live. And it's a PhD program, which I wanted to be in a PhD program. It's a department that I thought would be congenial with my kind of interests. And let me, if you'll support me, I'd like to spend a day or two, apply for this job, and then I promise to forget it. I'm back to work, on my other stuff. But of course, I knew he and others would have to write me letters of recommendation. So he said, okay. So, and the job was advertised so early, partly because Oregon had a search the prior year. They had brought in 4 candidates. They couldn't quite decide that any one of the 4 was quite right. So they offered somebody a 1-year position and re-advertised. That's why it was so early in the game. Anyway, I was true to my word. I just dived into the dissertation. I was working along, and by middle of November, I get a call from Eb Smith, who was chairman of the department at the time.
Great
out here.
guy.
Yep, a Minnesota grad and a really, really great guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, we've narrowed it down to a kind of medium list of 8 or 10, and we're trying to figure out, who our interview list will be. Can we have a conversation over the phone? And I think part of what he was really interested in was, would somebody who has a law degree and that kind of background really be interested in this kind of position? And also recognizing that, particularly in a not particularly affluent state like Oregon, we wouldn't be paying salaries like you get in a law firm. And of course, I understood these things, but I think I was able to be reassuring enough. And they invited me out for an interview in early December. And before Christmas, I had the job offer at Oregon, which was great. And so I just then blasted through the rest of my dissertation, finishing it up by about 8 months later, and then moved out to Oregon, figuring, wow, this would be a really good place to get started. And who knows? Well, I ended up not only getting started there, but staying for a long, long time.
It's been a while.
Yeah. I mean, so I joined
More
the
than
department.
30 years.
Yeah, the fall of '87. So literally, we have something called a tenure reduction program here, which the last few years, when you start that, you're doing a little less and administratively a little less teaching. The last day of my tenure reduction program was 2 days ago. So this is actually, now I'm fully emeritus professor, although I'm not really slowing down all that much. I've got a bunch of projects, and I've been appointed as visiting research professor at the University of Hong Kong for half of next year and so forth. So, who knows where it's going to go from here.
Let's talk about your interests in Hong Kong. Had you spent much time in Hong Kong before recent years?
Yeah, so I really, it goes back a little over 10 years ago, because my doctoral dissertation had been in Europe, in Belgium, and because I was fairly immersed in things going on, actually, not just about Belgium, but about the European community or European Union at large, because, Brussels, of course, is where I was living. It's where many of the central institutions of the EU are. The first 15, 20 years of my life was much more Europe, was primarily Europe and to some degree Middle East focused, because I got brought into some things initially in Israel, and then a bit in Egypt, eventually in Iran, which was very unusual for an American academic, but I actually managed to be in Iran 3 times between the early 2000s and about 2012. So that was much more my orbit. But I guess it's a little bit of a reflection of how the world was changing. China is emerging and both economic and international relations power. And I was asked to chair a study for the National Research Council of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences that was published in 2010. And it was called it was about so-called strategic directions for the geographical sciences, so it was a panel of really some leading American geographers. We were working on it, going back and forth to Washington D.C. or the NAS facility in Irvine, California. And we put together this report, and there's a leading geographer at the Chinese Academy of Sciences who was interested in this. And he invited me over to make a presentation at the Chinese Academy to talk to folks at Peking University, and they decided to translate it into Chinese. And then the Chinese edition I was brought over to presented at the opening session of the Chinese Geographical Society meeting, actually taking place in Urumqi at that time, out in Xinjiang. 4,000 people in the audience, still maybe one of the largest audience I've ever talked to, and presented the study. Well, then the invitations start flooding in, to come do this and come do that in different parts of China. But one of the things that it led to was an invitation to participate in a symposium in Hong Kong, which of course, one country, 2 systems arrangement is not mainland China, but it was 2012 or 13. I was over there and ended up talking to a friend of mine, Adrian Bailey, who had started his career at Dartmouth and then gone on to chair the department at Leeds and then was a dean at one of the universities in Hong Kong. And he said, your next sabbatical, you should think about applying for a fellowship program we have. You might be competitive for it, and it'd be great to have you here for a few months. So I did that and ended up actually getting the fellowship. So I went to Hong Kong for 4 months, actually, in 2015, winter, spring 2015. So that was my first serious introduction to Hong Kong, but it was not a tie with University of Hong Kong, which is where I'll be next year. It was elsewhere. I was actually living up in the New Territories at the time. But because of that, I got interested in Hong Kong. I started being involved in 2 or 3 things that are there, going back and forth for that. But I wasn't really thinking about anything beyond that. But then George Lin at the Geography Department of the University of Hong Kong, leading economic geographer, came to me a couple of years ago and said, HKU is starting a new program, a university-wide program where they're going to every year appoint 3 or 4 distinguished visiting research professors. I think, frankly, it was partly a reflection of this, new Chinese security law that has, kind of changed the political landscape in Hong Kong, and the brain drain that Hong Kong has been experiencing. University of Hong Kong, long one of the East Asia's leading institutions. They're concerned about losing people. They want to bring in folks who are going to make them feel like, or seem like still a kind of leading academic center. And he said, we'd like to put the department, any department or program can nominate one person. You'd like you to be our nominee, which was really, flattering. And I realized it would work out timing wise, where it would hit right when I was finishing my run at the University of Oregon. So I said, sure, and sent him materials. He said, it's a long shot. Don't expect anything. So I really didn't. I almost kind of forgot about it. And then 7 months later, here comes a letter from the president of the university with the appointment. So it'll be an interesting experience, a different experience before. University of Hong Kong's right down on Hong Kong Island, right in the kind of heart of things. We're hoping to find a place to live nearby. A couple of the law professors found out that my wife's going to be there. They've now given her an appointment. She's going to teach class, and it's going to be, I think, an interesting experience.
Well, that's a wonderful way to spend your post emeritus early years.
Right, exactly. Right.
Let's chat a little bit about your ideas concerning leadership and the status of geography. You wrote an article for the Chronicle of Higher Education 30 some odd years ago. Was it 30? It was close to 30.
Maybe not
ago.
quite that long. Maybe it was more like 25 or
20 something years ago.
Yeah.
And certainly your presidential address was to the AAG was associated with enhancing geography's position. Would you be kind enough to share some of your ideas concerning words of advice for leaders in the discipline? Leaders in academic departments, when there's so many changes taking place with regard to rebranding and catering to the demands of a very transient number of administrators and institutions. Any comments concerning how geographers in the academy can address these changing circumstances?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, particularly relevant and important one right now. And you're right. And if you actually look at the arc of my career, I mean, the first 10, 15 years was much more focused on doing the classic scholarship stuff. But then I actually started turning more to what one might think of as disciplinary service. Both in kind of the educational arena, because I ended up, through a variety of circumstances, chairing the committees that put together both the proposal and then the first version of the AP Human Geography class. And then I started becoming more involved in AAG committees and in the American Geographical Society as well, serving on the council, and then the National Research Council things sort of come as a result of all that. And so it's one thing leads to another. But I think to tie all this to your question, I think it's a critical time for geography. In a sense, it has been for a while, because unlike in many other parts of the world. To be a geographer, if you really think there's some value to looking at the world geographically, is a bit of a cause. It kind of almost has to be a bit of a cause in an educational landscape where, you know, the reality is geography has been fairly marginalized for much of the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. In K-12 education, there are many leading universities and even many smaller universities that don't have geography programs. And as a result, there's a kind of misunderstanding of what geography is on the part of many people and its potential. And so I think it was actually that sense of cause that really drove me in many ways towards leadership. But what was it? It wasn't just to wave a geography flag. I mean, sure, we all choose things, and we value them, and we have communities that develop along with them. But it was because during the course of my career, I had become increasingly convinced that if we fail to ask geographical questions about the world around us, we're really missing something really important. And, you know, back to that Financial Times article I've quoted, that's an example, but there are all sorts of other examples. I remember sitting in a meeting early on in my career at the University of Oregon, and there was a plan to start a German studies certificate. And this would be a certificate that undergrads would get to show that they had some knowledge of various things related to German language, people, history, and so forth. And I was I was an assistant professor, but I had been invited to participate because I had spent that year in Germany right out of college and so forth. So we were talking about it, various suggestions. What do people need to know? Well, language, obviously, you know, history, music, philosophy, you know, these sorts of things. Until I said anything, not a single person said anything about an environment or settlement patterns or, you know, the geographical context within which Germany is situated, the relationship to areas around it. In other words, there was a kind of thinking that was leaving out fundamental aspects of what it should mean to actually be some kind of expert in that part of the world. So I think, you know, there's all sorts of examples one can trot out of these sorts of things. But I think that then what that led me to do was not just to think about ways that as a leader, and I think this is so key for everyone now involved in these positions, not just to say, you know, geography is great because we do good things, but actually to work on developing the kind of compelling arguments and examples that show what's lost if geography is not at the table. And that doesn't mean staking out territory and trying to defend the boundaries of our discipline. That's ultimately a kind of intellectually vacuous enterprise. You know, sometimes the most interesting things happen at the borders between disciplinary structures and arrangements. But it means recognizing that if there's not a kind of core set of geographical perspectives and ideas that are being offered, our students are going to be missing something fundamental in their training, not just the ones who are going to be geography majors, but the ones who are going to go off and participate in a democratic society, to the kinds of questions that we should be asking about the world. They're going to have certain kinds of blinders on. And there are ways in which we have a hugely important role to play, both in the educational mission and in the research mission. And I think being convinced that those things were important to me, both the educational side and the research side, was something that helped me to be involved in kind of very different kind of leadership things, but I think is really important now to keep in mind for any kind of leader in geography and in higher education, because so often it's the mix of those things that is the sort of compelling center of gravity for making cases for geography and its importance.
Well, there's no question about that, and certainly we have the evidence. We have the evidence to justify our existence and the great benefits that our discipline and knowledge about geographical matters brings to students in their vocations as well as as public citizens.
Yeah, precisely.
We tend not to be very good in the grand scale of communicating that value to the marketplace, apparently, which is characterized by students, parents, and oftentimes academic administrative leaders.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. And it was part of what motivated me a few years ago to accept an invitation from Polity Press in Cambridge, England, that it started a series of books called the Why It Matters series. And this series of books was basically partially aimed at undergrads who might say, well, why should I study history? Why should I study anthropology? But also a little bit at the larger world, to sort of make the case for the value of looking at the world from different disciplinary perspectives. And they asked me to write the Geography Why It Matters book. Relatively short, not written for a bunch of insiders, but written for a general audience. And I was lucky enough to have a fellowship at the Bellagio Center on Lake Como in Italy. Give me a month to just.
Well, that's a nightmare.
Yeah, that was really, really a hardship. And I ended up, they actually wanted something. It was only 35,000 words, so really short book, relatively short book. They initially wanted 2 or at most 3 illustrations. I suggested 20 because maps and things like that. We compromised at 11, but that book was an effort to kind of address exactly what you're talking about. And I think the interest in these sorts of things reflected actually in the fact that Alianza Editorial in Madrid came and wanted to do a Spanish translation some years ago. The Peking University Press is translated into Chinese. The most recent translation is in Korean, Gimyeong Publishers in Seoul. And actually, there's a Persian translation that may be in the works. We're in the early stages on that one. But it shows
fascinating.
Yeah, there's an appetite for actually trying to understand what it means to think about the world geographically.
Well, that's great news, and I think we can use more of that to be directed in the right places among the decision makers. This is a wonderful place to really transition from, leadership in a sense, to reflect then upon your role not only as a teacher but as a mentor. I have known some of your students. Some of them have been interviewed. 1 or 2 more will be interviewed in the future. And many have appreciated you. I think the first student that I met that you served on her dissertation committee, it must have been more than 30 years ago. It was Ann Parker, who was one of Carl Johannessen's students.
Yep.
And she commented on how careful you were in terms of editing and writing. Very judicious in that manner, and you passed that on to her at that time. I guess what I'm going to ask you now is, how do you see yourself as a mentor?
Yeah.
And what recommendations might you have for other mentors, knowing that there's no one-size-fits-all model?
Right. No, that's a great question. I mean, the mentoring part of my career has been a really important one to me, and one that I've actually valued, because when one develops good mentoring relationships, I mean, it's not just the mentee that benefits, it's the mentor that benefits as well. And there's been great satisfaction. I've actually had 26 students complete PhDs under me over during the career, and I've got 1 more still in the pipeline that I'll still be involved with. He'll likely finish up in the next couple of years, the satisfaction of that is really great, and I've learned a great deal from them, and I hope vice versa. But I think in terms of sort of advice on the mentorship front, I think a couple things. You mentioned Ann Parker and the writing. Writing is so key. Maybe this will sound out of step with the times given the oncoming of AI and so forth, but I still feel that writing is so key that I really push my students on that front, and to be able to write and express things well, not just verb-noun agreement, but be able to construct an argument in an effective way is really key. But I also think there's a delicate balance in the early going of students. I want to be friendly, but also have some expectations and encourage them, but also give them the freedom enough freedom to find their own way. So I'm not the kind of, you've got to follow this path kind of advisor. I try to stay in fairly reasonable touch with what they're doing, but give them the freedom to explore something that they want to explore, because it's people who develop a passion around their topics, their research, are really the ones who are much more likely to finish the degree, to go on, and so forth, than the ones who just simply think about it as a credential that they have to get.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really interesting to note that, you do have to find that balance really in guiding students.
Right.
We only have about a minute or two to go here, and I'm going to ask you for, the last words of advice, and that would be to undergraduates and graduate students interested in pursuing geography, or those graduate students that are engaged in research, and also colleagues in the field. Do you have any pearls of wisdom you'd like to share?
Right. Well, I guess it would go a bit back to my last comment in response to the mentorship query, because I think finding something you're passionate about is so key. And, for colleagues, it's very easy. And of course, served as a mentor to junior colleagues over time. I was myself a junior colleague at one point. And I always say, it's important, of course, you're assistant professor, you're looking towards tenure and so forth. It's important to understand the rules of the game, to be aware of them, to keep them in mind. But don't just think about it as a set of hoops you have to jump through. Think about what you really care about. Think about what you really want to do. Think about the contribution you really want to make. And then, keep those things in mind. But if you do that, you're far more likely, actually, both to have a successful trajectory and also a happier life and more interesting life than just sort of feeling like, here's the hoops I have to jump through. As for undergrads, and that's kind of applies to grad students, I think, as well. As for undergrads, it's often just don't assume that geography is just memorizing a long list of place names. Just try it. Try taking a geography course and think about how it might open your eyes to ways of thinking and ways of understanding that might be a little different from what you've experienced in the past. And of course, there's a turnaround piece of advice there for people in academic departments who are staffing those lower division undergraduate classes that students might be most likely to take, which is put your most compelling teachers in those classes.
Mm-hmm.
We go back to Marvin Mikesell, who could hold a bunch of undergraduates in his spell, if you will, because he was so remarkably good at telling the kinds of stories that actually had rich analytical background to them that really got students interested.
Alec, thank you so much. You've really shared quite a bit, and what is really a short period of time. We could have gone on for several hours.
Yeah, I did feel that way at times, right? And I hope I didn't go on too long.
But it's really been a joy to listen to you talk about how really geography has not just been a career; it's been a way of life for you, and it's been a joyful one, and that's a great story in itself. Thank you so much once again.
I appreciate the opportunity, and we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but even something like my periodic boondoggles lecturing for the National Geographic Society on expedition, it's an example of just how sort of geography defines my life in various ways. And I just love being able to bring that geographical way of thinking about the world to people who take something like a National Geographic expedition.
Indeed, it's richly rewarding, isn't it?
It really is.
Well, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike.
All right. And this now concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.